Hi, I'm going to talk you through some of the setup that I do on AutoCAD. Out of the box, it's ready to draw, but there's a lot of ways to tune it up and make it a lot friendlier to use. This environment that you're seeing is probably, I assume, what your AutoCAD installation looks like right now with this medium gray background and small cursor. And I'm going to take you through some of the steps that I use to set up a default sort of environment, which tool palettes and which settings, some mouse customization, and so on. If we compare this to how my already customized AutoCAD looks, you can see a big difference. The black environment, the full screen crosshairs, some of the toolbars, the property toolbar or tool palette, is something that I always want handy. The external reference, which is how you attach other drawings into a given drawing. These are some things that I use all the time. The layer panel, I have a two screen system going at home, so that's off on the other monitor. I'm going to configure my version of plain old AutoCAD um, for one screen, just in case some of you are running a one screen system. So I'll have all my menus and key tool palettes available just on the one screen. The first place we're going to start is looking at some of the options. Right click on empty space, and in the context sensitive menu, go down and select options. Here's where we do a lot of the customization that we do once or twice. We've got profiles, we've got selection, some 3D modeling, drafting, and so on. Files, the way we find our support files, that becomes important a little later. For right now, let's look at some of the options in the display tab. Some simple things, but things that I think are kind of important to make a comfortable drawing environment. For example, color. The background color most CAD users select is a dark charcoal or a black, and the medium gray sort of makes me a little queasy. You can see that all the colors are customizable. You can have different environments for paper space versus model space versus 3D space and so on. I don't get into too much of that customization, but I do some of the basics like change the background color, change my cursor color, and so on. It's pretty easy to do. Um, and again, this is when you right click with nothing selected, go to the options, and here in the in the second tab, display, where we're making these changes. Um, the medium gray is not a good idea for a couple of reasons. Medium value colored lines are going to get lost in it. Either very light or very dark is the way to go. So black here is the classic choice, maybe a little bit old school. I'm going to do what I typically do, and that's change the color of the crosshairs or the cursor in AutoCAD and give it a color that's not typically drawn with. In my case, something like a purple or like a periwinkle here, that's going to stand out okay from the colors that I usually draw with. There's some other customization that has to go on here, like crosshair size. You notice the crosshair was small. Most CAD users like it to take up the entire screen. So here's a place where we can ramp that up that's a percentage from 5% to 100% and say okay. And right off the bat, you see the screen is very different. Another thing you can change, so these are the crosshairs. The little square where they intersect is called the pick box. And you can, just by typing in pick box, pull up that system variable or sysvar and change the value of it. I believe that's in like AutoCAD pixels or some abstract metric. So it was, I think, at 5. You can make it bigger or smaller, depending on what you're comfortable with and how your eyesight is. Also notice all this is happening on the command line. The command line is actually pretty important in AutoCAD. That's where the defaults come up. That's where you can sort of see what your input is. So I stretched that up to get a couple of lines of history there. which is how I like to see it. So I gave it a pick box value of 8, and you can see how large that center square has gotten. A little too big for me, maybe a 6, 5, something along those lines is going to work out. The smaller the pick box, the more detailed you can be, because when it's large, it's going to pick several things at once if they're near each other. Let's look at the options again. Once again, that's right-clicking in space and context-sensitive menu options. A couple of other things we need to check here. Looks like it's okay in most ways. Enabled with copy, that's a key one. Not sure how this opens from scratch anymore. I assume you're seeing pretty much what I'm seeing here on your new installation. Um, One of the things that we want to check is our right-click customization. This is the right-click on the mouse. We use the left and right buttons a lot, and they do different things, and we can select what they do. So the left click is just mouse button is just pick, but the right click can do different things depending on what's happening. So here we see if no objects are selected, it's going to be bring up a shortcut menu like it just did. We got our options through the shortcut menu. And then as we move down, if one or more objects are selected, right click means shortcut menu. I think I like this to be a repeat last command. And if I get this wrong, if I get this backwards, I can always change it back. But this is a system variable that stays with AutoCAD, not with any given drawing. So once you get the hang of how you like to draw, you can customize it even more. And on the third one, if a command is in progress, right click means different things. And I think I like this to mean enter. Again, once I start drawing, I'm so sort of like unconscious when I use AutoCAD now because I've been using it for so long that when I have to stop and think about it, sometimes it's a little weird. So it may be that I need to come back and change these later, but that's okay. Maybe that when you're halfway through a drawing, you decide you like some other behavior better, and you can always come back to the options and change what the right click does. I'd recommend um, going with what I'm going with on your install um, for now and see how you like it. And again, you can always um, change stuff later as you become comfortable with the different things. I'm just working through some of the tabs here, the selection, and we'll just say OK, and it'll keep those as system variables. Okay, I'm not sure why you get that error message, no system variable changed, because changing the system variables is precisely what we just did. If you hit F2, the function key, you get the entire um, text screen of the past history. And if you're really interested, you can set how much of it is displayed for any given F2 command. Notice here that an automatic save happened. AutoCAD has an automatic save feature that's very useful. It's not the crashiest of programs, but you probably will crash at some point. So know that there is an automatic save of the file happening periodically, and take note of where these files are stored. The file type is SV $. That's an automatic save type. And should you crash and need to restore an SV $, it's very easy to do. It'll open up just like a DWG file, and you're usually good to go. If you type in the command system variable save time, that tells you how often it's happening. So it looks like by default it starts at 10, that's 10 minutes. So every 10 minutes you get a new SV $ file created. You can understand how there's a balance. The quicker it happens, the more often you're inconvenienced, but also the less work you're going to save. Let's just grab a couple of simple commands here and see how our system variables are working. This ribbon at the top has a lot of the common drawing commands, and you see it's a tabbed environment. So we have home and insert and annotate, and a few other tabs up there. View controls how we set views. some management tools, printing configs, add-ins, which is a new one on me, collaborate, which is also, some of these are sort of new and I believe they come and go. mcolor, that's an add-in that I use for doing renderings. Um, Express tools is actually one of the more interesting menu options. This is some tools, some sort of specialized tools that were created originally by a third-party developer, and then ultimately AutoCAD bought them, and now they're included standard. Used to be you'd have to buy these separately and load these separately, and AutoCAD just sort of absorbed them. Some things like arc-aligned text, something I use a lot if I'm doing curvy roadways and I want my street name to follow the curve. AutoCAD before Express Tools didn't have that capability. So there's some very convenient tools here in Express Tools. Let's look at another behavior that CAD comes with set up, and this is called the dynamic input. Notice when I just do a line command, and here I'm just hitting L enter for line, L spacebar actually, spacebar is enter. Notice that on my cursor, on the crosshairs, I have all this information. I've got a floating sort of data point on there. Right now I'm just selecting the line just by picking it. You can see that the key grips, so-called grips, are highlighted, the endpoints and midpoint. Just a quick word on selection. If you go to the right with a box, it's called a window, and it shows up as blue. If you go left, it shows up as green and actually dashed. You can just barely see it. So there's a key difference here. If you go left, you have a crossing, and if you just touch it, touch an entity, it's selected. If you go right, it has to be completely within inside the selection box to be selected. I wish Illustrator had something like this. It's actually really useful. Two different ways of selecting entities that you'll find is really useful. So to the right, a window; to the left, a crossing, and they behave very differently. Um, One of the key things, one of the key palettes that I use is this properties dialog box. I'm going to hit the flyout on the properties tool here on the ribbon, and I always have this menu visible. It wants to dock. If you don't want it to dock on the left or right side of your screen, hold down Control when you move it there, and it'll stay floating. But the properties dialog box here, I'm going to hold down Control. I don't like docked tools. I like to have as much real estate visible for working as possible. And this properties dialog box is where I do a lot of editing. It tells you all the key things about selected entities. So you want to keep that one handy. Notice when I select that line, it tells me all the things about that line. The color, which is by layer, your new favorite color. You always want to work by layer if possible. The layer definition that it's on, right now it's on 0. I didn't create any new layers, so that's the only layer I have. The line type is also by layer, and so on down the line. Line weight by layer. If it can be controlled by layer, you want to control it by layer. The reason being, if you have 500 or 1,000 lines, you never want to have to go in there and select them to change their properties. If you can just change the layer property, and then all your lines will reflect that. So by layer is the way to go. Notice I have also the coordinates of this line, start and end X, Y, and Z coordinates, as well as the length and the angle of this line in space. We're always working on a coordinate system in AutoCAD, and 0, 0, like a Cartesian plane, that's your sort of anchor point. Even if you're working on something that maybe doesn't seem coordinates intensive, the coordinates are still there. Like if you think of those little sculptural things I did when I showed my work, that's not land planning. That's doesn't require Illinois State plane or anything, but there's still coordinates that are at work. Just like on a page in Illustrator, you don't think about it in terms of coordinates, but it is. And here we're working on a true Cartesian plane. Notice my angle here, I'm at 27%. And some of these values can be changed within this properties box. Here I'm changing the coordinates of the start point, and some of them cannot. Some of them you have to edit the line itself, and then the values change and reflect that edit in the properties dialog box. But the properties dialog box is definitely one of the key palettes. I recommend having this one visible and expanded at all times. Let's look at another key palette. That's the layer palette. I opened it up by hitting the layer properties tab in the ribbon. You can also type in the word layers, that'll do it. This is another ribbon, another tool palette that I keep open all the time, usually on my second monitor. I'm going to expand the different columns here, and each of these are fields that control something about the layers. So here we are on layer 0 by default. Never draw on layer 0. That's the first commandment of AutoCAD. You can have as many layers as you want and just don't draw on layer 0. On off, that just turns the visibility of the layer on or off. You see it gives you an error message when you try and do that, and tells you, it warns you that you're going to turn the current layer off. It's typically not something you want to do. That just controls the visibility of the layer. Next to that is freeze or thaw. Freeze is like on off, only it's like really off. When something is frozen, it doesn't regenerate when you key a regeneration. This is a little bit, it's actually useful, you'll find when you get a little more advanced, to have two different kinds of off for different reasons. But this is legacy from a time when regens took a long time to do. Now your regens will take a few seconds and they're not a big deal. But back in the day, the early days of CAD, you could freeze layers that you didn't need to regenerate. And when you regenerate a layer, you reconstruct it. You would trigger a regen before you left the office for the day, and it would regen overnight. It would take hours to regen. And if you could freeze some of the layers and take them out of the process, that was useful. These days, of course, with the powerful computers we have, regens just take a few seconds on a complex drawing, maybe 20 seconds, 30 seconds if you've got extremely complex drawing. But it's not an issue in that way anymore. But you'll find it useful for other things. When you want something really off, it's out of your mind, or if you have another drawing referenced into your drawing, that other drawing is on a layer itself, and I typically will freeze or thaw those layers. Lock, that locks the editing capability of a layer, but you can still see it. Plot, sometimes you want a layer not to plot, like a viewport. And then color, line type, line weight, transparency. That's visual transparency of a entity, a line or a fill area. And then there's a description. You can type in a more detailed description about the layer. Here's 50%. I turn my transparency down. You can see it looks faded out. Doesn't look white anymore. It looks gray on the screen. And that's something I use all the time with fill areas. I like just a little bit of color, like a sort of watercolor look, and I like the transparency. I've got my layer dialog set up on this sort of auto hide, so it's not taking up my screen all the time because it would fill up the screen. Actually, in my actual working setup, I have this on my second monitor, open and huge all the time, because layer control is something that you're always working with. It's one of the fundamental ways of controlling what's going on in the drawing and how it looks. But for my single screen installation, I'm going to keep it on auto hide, and just hovering over that left side of it will make it expand anytime I want to do some layer change. Let's look a little more at what the layer dialog does here. And I can't emphasize this enough. Do not draw on layer 0. You've got an unlimited number of layers possible, so just make a new layer for whatever you're drawing on. Layer 0, you'll come to find, has a special purpose. in AutoCAD. You can do it, but don't. Here I'm just going to bomb out a few new layers using the new layer icon in the layer dialog. And they notice that the new layers take all the characteristics of the current layer. So they're white, they're 50% transparency, and so on. I can shift select all of change all their parameters. I can slow double click over the name and rename them. So let's try and do some simple layer control here and some simple drawing. So I'm going to call this layer lines, and I'm going to call this layer viewport. Viewport is a special layer. It's akin to the data frame in GIS. This is the special rectangle by which we look from paper space to model space. And we typically want this to be a non-plotting layer. You'll think about GIS. Sometimes you just don't want to see that rectangle, that data frame. Sometimes you do, usually not. So here I'm just going to turn off the plotting um, portion of the layer, and we'll see it. It's useful to see because you need to change the shape and so on, but you typically don't want it to plot. I typically don't want it to plot. Usually there's so much going on in the layer, in the viewport, that the line work itself defines the shape of the viewport. You don't need another rectangle that doesn't do anything. I'll just give this a uh, uh, more proper name. Names of layers are typically modular. So here I'm calling it PL-lots. PL for property line, lots for a type of property, and move to specific. Let's call this layer PL dash CL, so property line dash center line. Let's call this layer PL dash easement. So PL, I'm doing property line stuff, and then the next module in the layer name is more specific. So within this sort of boundary information, this property line information, I'm going to have lots, center lines, easements, and then I'll have the property line itself, PL. This is nice because you can arrange um, layers alphabetically, something you can't do in Illustrator, say, or GIS. Here, I'm just going to give it a color. Um, Color and plotting and how things look is a topic to explore in more detail later. Uh, Typically, the color on the screen for lines is not the color it plots. Pretty much lines we draw black. You don't use color for lines except in less common cases. If you think about like a watercolor rendering, the areas will be colored, but the lines themselves are typically black pen. And that's sort of the model that we use when we're drawing in CAD. The lines want to be black, but different widths, different thicknesses, and different line types, and the areas are colored. Going back to the early days of CAD, the plotters, they were called plotters, not printers. Colors, look how they're divided with it. There's 256 Windows colors, but there's special colors, red, yellow, green, cyan, blue, that I'm selecting right now. And these are actually known to use this line weight by color, you might say, to determine line weight. And my company does as well. And there are lots of ways of doing this, and like the architects have their own way and their own layer naming. Engineers have their own way. Certainly, governments have their own way. IDOT has their own system. It becomes technical and complicated pretty quick. In another video, or maybe next week, I'll introduce the it's more a function of how you want your screen to look. So I'm using colors here. I'm setting them up in a very classic way, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, skinny to fat. So my property line is going to be fat. Number 9 I have in my mind set up as thin, black line. I'm going to make the easement a line type. Notice I don't have any line types loaded, but as soon as I go to load, it finds the acad.lin file. And this is where all the line definitions, line type definitions are stored. And when you load this up, you can load as few or as many of this file as you want. I usually just go ahead and load them all since I'm bothering, and then now I can select which one I want for that layer. So sort of a two-step process to load line types. Sorry, my Creative Cloud is updating while I'm trying to do this. So something for an easement, that's typically a dashed line. Um, Hidden line is a smaller dash. I like to use that. I typically like smaller dashes. For the center line, I'm going to make that a skinny black line, and center is a line type. Again, center 2 is typically the skinnier line type. For the viewport, or sorry, for the lots, I'm going to make it a fat line, but not as fat as my overall boundary, which is the most important line on a page, and see how that's looking. Let's draw something. Let's draw a rectangle here. And so this is going to be on whatever the current layer is. So here's my dynamic input again. Notice it's giving me all this information. Now I've turned ortho on, which makes you draw perfectly horizontally or vertically or at 45. That's F8 to quickly turn on or off ortho drawing. So here I'm going to start getting into object snaps. I'm drawing a few, let's say, lots. And in AutoCAD, you never just draw in space, you're always snapping to other geometry. So here I'm snapping to endpoints and points on the line. And object snap is triggered from the right um, mouse button. Here I'm just copying those again. And if I'm running through this pretty quickly, I just want to give you some sort of idea more about setup and approach, not necessarily trying to show you command for command what's going on. So I'm trying to do just a quick setup here of like a, kind of like a subdivision type thing with some lots and a property line and a center line. And select that, delete. Um, to just give you some idea of how the colors look and how the line types look. Here's a useful command, the offset command, where you can select something and easily offset it a given distance. You can define the distance, or in this case, I'm just going to freehand it. I said through, and look how easy it is to change a layer. I just selected the entity, and then from the properties, I just changed its layer definition there. It takes on because everything's by layer, it takes on the color and line type and transparency of that new layer. So very, very quickly, once you have a few layers set up, and I've used three commands here: rectangle, line, and offset. And that's it to draw simple geometry. It's actually fairly straightforward. Distance, you can define the distance, or in this case, I'm just going to freehand it. I said through, and look how easy it is to change a layer. I just selected the entity, and then from the properties, I just changed its layer definition there. It takes on because everything's by layer, it takes on the color and line type and transparency of that new layer. So very, very quickly, once you have a few layers set up, and I've used three commands here: rectangle, line, and offset. And that's it to draw simple geometry. It's actually fairly straightforward. Okay, so here's our simple construction. Let's take this a little further. And similar to GIS, where you had map space and layout space, here we're going to what's always been called paper space. I think they call it layout mode now, but I'm going to the first layout tab. It's the same thing as GIS, where you have this sort of viewport akin to the data frame, but here the proper terminology is viewport. It's just a rectangle. Right now it's on the default layer. I'm going to put that on the viewport layer, so it doesn't plot, but you can move it, you can scale it. On the one hand, it's just a rectangle, but it's a very special rectangle. So it connects the two worlds of the paper space and the model space. So you can see if I double click inside of it, just like in GIS, I can zoom. I'm just using my middle mouse scroll wheel here to zoom. P enter, P spacebar gets you the pan tool. I'm just sort of centering it up in my viewport. Double click outside of it, and you're back in paper space. Um, I remember we made this layer called viewport that doesn't print. I also give it a layer that I'm not likely to confuse with one of the first 5 colors, the red, yellow, cyan. So I'm giving it this sort of teal color, which, as we know, the only thing that's teal are rental cars. And I'm going to now change the definition of that viewport to the viewport layer. And so it's not going to plot. I don't want to see that rectangle. I typically don't want to see that when I'm actually going to print. So with it selected, I'm going to change its layer definition. Notice it tells me it's a viewport. It's not a rectangle. It's a special type of entity. In the properties tab here, it's telling me information about it, color by layer. I'm going to put it on the viewport layer, and I hit escape, so it's deselected, and now it's rental car teal. And I know that the way I work, that's not typically something that's going to print. I'm going to do a quick preview and see how it's going to print as if I was going to plot a PDF, and you can see the viewport is not visible. And all my lines are the color that the layers were defining them as. But as I said, typically those colors aren't what prints, and you would certainly never have a yellow line. So there's usually, you go to this extra step and you select a plotter control file, a CTB file. I'm just going to use the default monochrome that comes with it, and it's just going to negate all the colors and draw everything as black, probably grays if there was transparency involved. There's other things to get with on the plot dialog, but for right now, I just want to show you how this is typically the workflow. You draw in color so you don't lose your mind. You can keep layers straight from each other, but you print lines black. If we had some fills, those may or may not be in color, sometimes gray. It's a good idea when you're first learning how to draw to use just black and white and line weights. I'm not using any line weights yet, but it's let's actually try a little fill, because fills are kind of fun. Fills properly known as hatches within AutoCAD. So I'll make a hatch layer, always have everything on its own layer. Every class of object should be on its own layer. More layers are better than fewer layers, absolutely, in the AutoCAD world. Notice here I can sort by layer. I can sort by color as well. And you could sort by line type even if for some reason you wanted to, but mostly it's alphabetized. We sort by name, and it's easiest to find layers when you have a bunch. I'm going to make this hatch. I'm going to fill my hatch, my property line, with just a light green. We like green in planning. It implies that we're creating all this lovely green space. I'm going to set that layer current, and I'm double clicking on that icon next to the layer name. You could also right click on the layer name and set current. And here I'm going to start the hatch command, and that brings up a different ribbon. And there's different ways of hatching, as you'll find. Solid fill, which they didn't always have in AutoCAD, I find to be almost my default hatch now. And there's two basic ways of hatching. You can pick a point and it's going to look for a boundary, as I'm doing now. I'm suggesting a point that I might pick. Or you can select a closed object, and it has to be a closed object, and you can apply hatch that way. So two different ways of doing it. And again, with my what I know about selections, I can do windows or crossings, or in this case, I'll do a crossing to the left. And now the last thing I want to do is draw order that to the back. Unfortunately, draw order is a separate thing. It's a little primitive how it handles it. Um, but it becomes an issue only when you're dealing with solid colors. Lines, black lines can override each other and the draw order doesn't matter. Let's do a quick preview and you can see that my non-standard color is plotting in color, but my standard colors, my index colors, are plotting as black. That's classic CAD behavior. So the index colors 1 through 9 are going to plot as black in this monochrome system, but your Windows colors up to 256 will plot in yellow. So that's a sort of quick and dirty tour of some of the key concepts of AutoCAD. Again, the properties toolbar and layers toolbar, these are two of the go-to tools. You can do the vast majority of work you do is likely to be in there. And here I'm going back and forth between model space and paper space. One last word about this dynamic input. I actually don't care for it. It doesn't, you can leave it on if it doesn't bother you. It bothers me. It's too newfangled for me, and frankly, I don't have use for it. The idea being that when a field is highlighted, you can key in values, but it's not how I work. So here, if I wanted to have it exactly 24 degrees, or sorry, 24 units long, I can type it in and enter it, but I just don't construct like that. That's not Euclidean geometry to draw in that fashion. So I just turned it off. You can go back into options and find the settings for that and turn it off. But let's just erase some stuff here before I finish up that thought. So as you might notice, this is a strange sync with the video, and I have to apologize. I lost the video track of the original video, so I'm doing a voiceover of, oh, I'm sorry. Uh, Turns out I didn't like my right-click customization, so I'm resetting it there. So check those values. Those are the actual ones that I recommend. Rewind the video and check the values I changed it to. So I lost my vocal track on this originally, and I'm having to now try to remember what the hell I was saying when I originally did it. So that explains the weird like time lag in this video. Sorry about that. Anyway, the point I want to make is if you want to get rid of this dynamic input, the quickest way, you can do it through options, but just type in the system variable dynmode, D-Y-N-M-O-D-E, and change that to 0. And that turns off all the dynamic input, which is how I prefer to work. If you like it, keep it on. Dyne mode, I think, has a value of 0 to 3. It can be fully off, fully on, or certain aspects in between. I like it off, and I like the right click to be enter when I'm in the middle of a command. Just like to draw a line, hit my right mouse button, and it's done. That's how I like to work. So it's always easy to change and change back now that you know a little bit about customization. So give it a try. I'd recommend trying my settings. I think they're sort of very intuitive and make a lot of sense for me. And they also sort of adhere to Euclidean geometry. Here I'm going to make a couple of new layers. TXT prefix. This means text. I'm going to flash in just a quick title block. We were talking about doing a title block the first week. I saw some pretty nice work. If you haven't gotten that turned in yet, drop your DWG file into the Dropbox folder. So TXT is a sort of real world check on how we name layers. It's not part of the actual drawing, but it's something that I will need to edit and draw and control. So those layers that are basically informational have their own layer prefixes and module naming as well. So I've set up TXT, TB, title block, lines, and TXT dash title block. So I'm going to go ahead and try and draw a real quick and dirty sort of title block. My quick and dirty stuff is truly quick and dirty. You guys have a little more time to produce something that looks more respectable. So do take the time. And let's think about this. So all the work I showed you had a title block attached to it, and it's just informational, and it shouldn't be like a huge deal. It shouldn't draw attention to itself. It's just a way of framing whatever work you're presenting, but it's traditional to have. There's some things that need to be on there, like your name. I would go with the UIC logo, stuff like that. Usually has some sort of rectangle that frames it. So let's start there. And how big should it be? Well, are you working at 24 by 36? Are you working 11 by 17? There's a few ways to draw rectangles. And maybe I should leave this for another day. I don't want this um, to be out of sync with the drawing. So I'm going to stop here and come back and redo this last part of the video and make another short video on how I drew my title block, because this out of syncness is probably driving you crazy. And frankly, it's a little weird for me to be trying to understand what I was thinking, last night. Okay, so I'm going to end it there, and email me with any questions, and I'll post another video on how I flashed together a simple title block in a couple of days.